Okay, great. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining our Q&A webinar today on telling your school's financial story and validating your PPP story. I'm very excited to have Grace Lee and Jennifer Hillen from Venable and NBOA with us. We know this is probably the most top of mind situation, not only with just the PPP right now, but then going into the fall, what is going to happen and how are you going to model this out and talk to your parents, your board, your finance committee, your whole greater community. So with that said, let's get started. A little bit about Armanino. Our goal is to be the most innovative and entrepreneurial firm out there that makes a positive impact on our clients, our people, our communities. Hopefully you'll see some of that here today. What matters most to you is that we work with over 200 private schools, over 800 nonprofits, and we have a national presence. And we really want to just try to help the private school community as much as possible. We do have our COVID-19 Resource Center up on our website. It is broken down by the 4 categories that we think all organizations are looking when it comes to getting through this pandemic, and that is on our next slide, Marie, which is managing cash and cash controls, accessing government aid, working with their workforce, and managing communications. And just so be it that all of those topics will be covered today. My name is Dean. I'm a partner with Armanino. I've been working with private schools for 20 years. Go ahead, Kathy.
Hi, I'm Kathy Ferguson. I work with Armanino as well. I'm a senior manager out of our Texas office.
Grace.
Hi, I'm Grace Lee. I'm a partner at Venable, and I work in the independent school practice, working with schools across the country on all of the legal issues.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Hillen, Vice President of Professional Development and Business Affairs with NBOA. And prior to joining a few years ago, I sat where you sat at your schools. So it's nice to be on the other side and trying to work with a lot of you today.
Awesome. Well, with that said, let's hop to it. A little overview. We'll kind of go into a quick overview of the PPP and kind of making sure that if you are going to keep those funds, that you have your forgiveness plan kind of laid out. We'll talk about some NBOA survey insights from Jennifer and what we're hearing across the industry now, and then we'll start talking about predicting what COVID-19 could do to the financial impact to your school and how we could tell your story. So that's our overview today. With that said, we know all about it. It feels like we've been in this whirlwind for a while, Grace. Maybe give us some high-level insight. Go ahead, Marie, to the next slide. We all know about the CARES Act, and it's there to help everyone. I think that you guys did a great webinar yesterday. Maybe you can give us some of the high-level insights there for private schools.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Yes, Dean, we've been in this for many weeks now, just sort of helping schools to understand the CARES Act, understand the PPP loan. And, you know, as the weeks have gone by, it sort of started out as this wonderful gift, right? Like, oh, this loan, and we can get it forgiven and we can use it in 8 weeks. And then, of course, we have seen a lot more scrutiny as the weeks have gone by, and we've been working with schools and monitoring what's been happening in Congress on this loan to sort of see how we can best help navigate it for our schools. As we know, the CARES Act does provide you know, a loan of up to 2.5 months of the monthly payroll, 2.5 times the monthly payroll, up to $10 million. And it can be used for certain things. It can be used for payroll costs, rent, utilities, interest on mortgage, and other debt obligations. The first 8 weeks of the loan period, if it is used properly, and we can talk about that, it is forgivable after 8 weeks. If you use 75% or more for payroll costs, mortgage interest, utilities, or rent. A conversation we've had in great detail with our independent schools is, what does it mean to take this loan from the perspective of, is it federal financial assistance? And just so that we're all on the same page on this call, it is considered federal financial assistance, so you do have to comply with Title IX, Section 504, the Age Discrimination Act, and Title VI. Those non-discrimination laws do apply. And to the extent that you can avoid using this money for mortgage interest, rent, or utilities, we are recommending at an abundance of caution that you avoid using the money for those purposes, just because they might attach, there is some guidance that says that it will attach the loan to the real property. We did do a webinar, thank you for this slide. We did do a webinar at Venable on this very topic, and we went into a lot more detail about loan forgiveness, what the loan means, and what schools can do now to prepare for a possible audit. If you want, you can listen to the recording and download the slides from that webinar, which was done by my partner, Allison Baker, who has a background in the financial services industry, has helped companies and nonprofits go through audits and investigations. And so she brings a lot of insight and wisdom into what the SBA and Treasury might be looking at as they evaluate these loans.
And Grace, you know, it says right there, supporting the good faith certification. I feel like that's what kind of is causing everybody a little bit of squirminess a little bit is, well, what does that mean? And maybe you can just provide some quick insight there.
Sure, let's talk about that. So the reason we're all concerned about good faith certification is that in weeks after the CARES Act first came out, Treasury and SBA issued some additional guidance through their FAQs. And in that guidance, they said, oh, by the way, you know, borrowers, you have to make a good faith certification that the current economic uncertainty makes this loan request necessary to support ongoing operations, taking into account your current business activity and other sources of liquidity. And that was sort of a new sort of angle, right? When we first took the loan, there was no requirement to look at other sources of liquidity. And so that guidance has come out. We've seen a lot more scrutiny from, you know, Mnuchin, and there's been articles written about this. And what we are advising schools do is, you know, they've extended the deadline to make this good faith certification until May 14th. I know that's only a few days away, and we might get additional guidance on how to make the good faith certification, but based on what we know now, which is right, we're working with the information that we have.
Preliminary final guidance.
Right, exactly. Might change tomorrow, you never know. Right. Based on what we know now, we are advising that schools take another look, reevaluate your decision, and really document what did you look at to make this good faith certification. And the factors to consider are your other sources of liquidity. So, you know, there's been a lot of attention drawn to endowments. Look at your endowment, but also explain whether or not it's reserved, whether or not there's, you know, it's encumbered in any way. Look at other factors like increased demand for financial aid. We know that a lot of families have been impacted by this pandemic. Look for things like potential reduction in enrollment, potential layoffs, operational challenges, you know, inability to obtain revenue through your auxiliary services like your summer camps or your facility rentals. I know for some of you, that's a big percentage of money that you bring in every year. And so those are the factors to look at. And the process that you want to take is to really demonstrate through financial modeling how these factors will impact your overall budget, your outlook for the next several quarters, you know, and sort of capture in real time any data that's supporting your models, whether you have already received requests for financial aid, whether you've already received, you know, withdrawals from enrollment for next year. We know that some of this might be right around the corner, but, you know, model it out so that you as a school and even at the board level can demonstrate that you looked at all of this, you looked at what it's going to, you know, what the impact is going to be, And based on those models, you've decided that in good faith, this is still a loan that you need to take.
Great, great. Yeah, thank you so much, Grace. Yeah, I think that the questions are starting to fly in about modeling and how are we going to tell these stories. We're going to get into that here shortly, but definitely with regards to insight, and go ahead, Marie, go to the next slide. I mean, we do know that this is getting a lot of media attention. I think there's a financial need, and then there's also the media and public relations aspect of things as well. We see all of these organizations have been talking about that. And then we know about, Marie, go ahead and go to the next slide, the tweet heard around the private school world, right? I think what you guys talked about yesterday is, yeah, there are going to be private schools with significant endowments that have taken a PPP loan. We know that there's a lot of endowments that could be board designated, and then we could have some that are coming from the donors themselves that are restricted. And how are you going to tell that story is going to be crucial, and we'll start doing that here in a second. Before we do, let's kind of hear from a national level. Jennifer, let's kind of hear, what are you guys hearing in some of your preliminary surveys and touches with the private school community?
Yeah, sure, happy to. Well, besides hearing a lot about misconceptions around the independent school business model, and particularly what it means to have an endowment, we're hearing a lot more. So I just wanted to thread that loop with the conversation we were just having, that there are considerations on both sides of the coin, no pun intended, as to whether or not schools ended up accepting PPP funds or will by 2 days from now, or will not. In most cases, school leaders with their boards are making prudent, defensible decisions for their schools either way. I think the concept of good faith is important to keep in mind. I saw a question come through just now, what if you're wrong? I think there's a lot of guidance to follow that you can document, and you can make clear why you made the decisions you made. No one's got a crystal ball. Some of us are going to be wrong with what we expect. So I'm excited to get into the modeling a little later on for that reason. So otherwise, what we're seeing, in general, I want to start on a positive note. I'm so proud to be part of this community because independent schools truly have shown their value propositions in unparalleled ways in recent months, keeping hundreds of thousands of students in the classroom virtually, but still in the classroom. And we're in a challenging time, but this is a season. Remote and online learning will not forever eclipse the value of face-to-face in-person learning around which we've traditionally structured our models. So we will get back to that sooner than later, and hopefully better off for everything we've learned in the meantime. But in the meantime, there are real issues that schools are facing, and they're bringing to the surface some things that may have been bubbling up for a long time. Schools are where they are now because of where they've been. And unfortunately, I think there are some, we've already seen a few close. There are others who may not be opening their doors, whether virtually or in person this fall. But plenty still will. The industry is not going anywhere, but we're impacted by this. A recent survey from NAIS of heads of schools revealed that 22% think their school will emerge financially weaker as a result of the pandemic. So as schools seek to survive and hopefully thrive, the wisest ones are getting, plans B, C, and D in place as well. And we can help you figure out what that looks like. So some schools are planning on 2 price points for next year that would account for continued distance learning or returning to campus. Others are forging ahead with their existing enrollment contracts, no matter the delivery method. Most schools are scenario planning with variables related to attrition, retention, the ability to attract new students, fundraising, that we're seeing that go either way. Certainly some families have less disposable income to give, but others are rising to the occasion and supporting schools in new and different ways as a result of the pandemic. A lot of variables around tuition, financial aid, staffing, and support from resources like your endowment and reserves. So we've done some surveys. You'll see that on these 2 slides. I'm obviously trying to give some context around those too, because you can read what's on the slides. In general, we're looking at different scenarios through a partnership with the Enrollment Management Association, for example. They're advising scenario planning, including attrition at 0%, 10% and 20%. We're looking at planning on decreased tuition revenue, anywhere from flat to 20% lower revenue next year, and maybe even worse in some cases. In the 08-09 crisis, financial aid awards increased 20%, which some are saying may be the best case scenario this time around. There are a lot of questions about market projections and potential endowment implications. We're all financially savvy enough to know that now's not the time to be liquidating investments if you can avoid it. And I know that there are different conversations we need to have right now. Certainly need to be sure we're covering the good faith certification for the PPP fund. And then beyond that, thinking about what your endowment looks like in the long run. If you don't feel the impact too significantly now, it's probably because of the 3-year rolling average that a lot of schools base their endowment draw on. But you're going to start feeling it, and you may want to pursue a more conservative approach this next year. Maybe you work with the board not to use that 3-year rolling average, but maybe you use the endowment value now as the basis for a draw, which would likely be a lot lower than what you draw otherwise. Whatever you can do within reason to preserve value, I think, is important. At the same time, when we're looking at financial aid families, we look at their ability to pay. I realize an endowment is viewed as ability to pay for certain needs for the school. So there are a lot of different ways to look at this. You see this survey data, some additional information behind it. 228 people replied to this just quick flash survey we did last month. Another 200 participated in some polling we did on a webinar. So these data points are pulled from both of those resources. I won't read to you what's on the screen, but I'll give you some other info. So fewer than half of business officers projected meeting the FY20 budget expectations. 1/3 of those projected a deficit. Not too surprising, but it is concerning given that for the most part, tuition had already been collected for this year. So while most of us are concerned about next year and going forward, we're already feeling the impact with this fiscal year. Overall, it doesn't appear that any particular size or type of school is in a better position right now than others. And I think the right now is really important. There are obviously different implications for boarding schools, especially those dependent on international students. Small schools are really feeling this the most. So I think if we take the right now out and look going forward, this is going to be different. Regardless of size, though, or type, many schools are projecting decreases in revenue and therefore are hoping to moderate their expenses next year, but at the same time are incurring additional costs to manage the pandemic. Most have changed their fundraising efforts in some way as a result of the pandemic. More than 1/3 plan to reduce their budgeted contributions for next year. Most schools that we've polled had received PPP funds, and they were going to keep those funds even if subject to federal financial assistance. I say even if because at the time, we, thanks to our partnership with Grace and NAIS, were deep in advocacy for independent schools to have that compliance burden lifted from the industry. Unfortunately, it is still in effect. So I wanted to contextualize some of these polling results. I think that the guidance that has continued to roll out may have changed the answers that these webinar poll participants would have given. I know more schools have decided to return funds in recent weeks since the last time we polled them, but plenty of schools did decide to keep the funds. And I think there are very valid considerations and conversations on either side. When asked when their schools might reopen physically, a lot of school leaders think that it's likely in-person classes will resume in the fall. They're optimistic, but others are going ahead and pointing towards January or even next fall. Right now, enrollment for next year is still uncertain, which I think is reflective of families' unknown financial positions right now. Some schools have been extending deadlines for enrollment contracts, amending them, etc. So that was a lot. I can stop talking now, but I have plenty more to say. So just let me know if that covers it. And
I think that's very helpful, Jennifer. I think that any kind of survey insight, as we know with private schools, we love benchmarking. We love knowing what other schools are going through and kind of how they're planning to go through that. I think that it's going to be very imperative when you talk about 2021, what those benchmarks look like and the KPIs and the leading indicators as people start to look at long-term sustainability and, like you said, hopefully thrive out of this situation.
Yeah.
So with that said, let's jump into our model. We'll start going through, oh yeah, and last thing, go ahead, why don't you quickly talk about the COVID Resource Center for the NBOA.
Oh, sure.
Really deep.
Yeah, thank you for including this. Visit our COVID-19 resources page. NBOA has been hard at work, just as Venable and Armanino and others you work with closely, to develop and deliver content every single day to support you. So webinars, articles, resources. One that I would point you to in particular is a checklist for reopening. That's something we've been asked quite a bit about. So go to the COVID-19 resources page. You'll find an article around considerations for reopening. Whenever you may look at doing that, doesn't mean it's happening tomorrow, but it will happen. So go find that checklist and everything else we've got out here. We'll link to this recording too, I hope.
Actually, you know what? And before we do, let's actually give a little bit more insight before the model. We're going to ask a couple of polling questions. We do have close to 300 people on, and we thought it would be good to share some of the insight amongst the people on here. So with regards to that, our very first polling question is, what is expected increase to financial aid you are budgeted for 2021? No increase, less than 5%, 5 to 10%, greater than 10%. And we'll give everybody a couple seconds to kind of fill that in. I'd be interested to see of the 300 people that are on, what is the range of financial aid that we're seeing. And we'll close this poll in 3, 2, 1. Greater than 10%, between, yeah, so between 5 and greater than 10. So we're gonna see some need. Let's go to our next question. I think it'll be coming up here in a second. And are we expecting any decrease in enrollment for 2021? Go ahead and fill this in. And if you were on that webinar yesterday, this is where you start to think about that double hit or that double dip, right? We have less revenue and our kids that are coming in might have more need. And we'll close the poll now. Go ahead and see where we are there. Okay, again, that's pretty insightful, but we're definitely we're gonna see the impact. Okay, this will be very helpful when we go through our modeling. What's our next question, Marie? We have started to talk to some schools that are going to do a specific COVID-19 fundraisers. And can some families support other families, right? Jennifer and Kathy, I think we're hearing that more and more. Is that something that your school is considering for next year? And we'll close that poll. Unsure. All over. We don't quite know yet. It looks like we're trying to figure it out. We're trying to figure out what the impact is to our school and how we're going to do it. What's our last question, Marie? I think this is our last one. Oh boy, here we go. So far, this one's going to be all over the map. I think depending on what the story here is, what is going to be the story for your school with regards to keeping PPP funds? And we'll close that. Okay, we're going to keep those funds, then let's make sure that we're telling the right financial story as we work through it here. Thank you, Marie. Let's close those polls and let's start walking through how we can do some predictive modeling around COVID and its impact to your school and how you can potentially tell your story to your constituents. We will be using today the Armanino Private School Financial Framework Toolkit. You see the website up top. It is available for free for download on our website. Please feel free to go there. If you want some help with that model, we could do that as well through lots of different ways. So please feel free to go there and download this toolkit. And with that said, let's walk through some different scenarios. I think, Kathy, you built up a lot of different scenarios. Grace and Jennifer, if you hear something or see something that's insightful or that you think everybody should really pay some close attention to, please feel free to jump in. Go ahead, Kathy.
Yeah, so this is our large school. So we've done 3 scenarios here, and essentially we'll give you some basic information about it. And then we'll look, what does it look like if a mild case or in a more severe case where they have a bigger impact. And so in this particular case, it's a K through 12. They've got about 1,300 students. They've got an operating budget of about 38 million, an endowment of 33. They're paying back their debt. Right now, they're scheduled to pay back 1.5 million of their debt during the current year. And their financial aid budget is about 25% of their tuition. So what does this look like? So if they have a mild impact of COVID-19, so how is that impacting your school? We're going to look at some that we would say is a lighter case scenario, and then some with a heavier case scenario. In this particular case, we've said, what if there was a 1% decrease in students? Remember, they have 1,300 students. That'll be about 13 students in this case. What if financial aid goes down goes up only about 5%? And then we don't do anything. In all of these models, we've not done anything to rectify it. We want to see the true impact so that we can evaluate it. They've also lost all of their auxiliary revenue for summer school. So in this case, you'll see on the far right side that they had budgeted an operating gap. So all of their operating expenses, all of their operating revenue, less their expenses, of $565,000. And that is going to shift, even in this mild case, to about $2 million of operating loss. And then the next slide will show, okay, so how do we cover that? So they expected that $500,000 decrease, an operating gap of about $500,000. You can tell in their original budget, they had budgeted to pretty much make that back up in their contributions. How are they going to get that in? Basically, their annual fund, their endowment draw, their investment income on some of their operating investments, some of those types of ways, right? So they thought they could pretty well cover that. And in this mild case, we're going to say there's no annual fund decrease. They did have a slight 1% decrease in students, but they kept all of their annual fund. There was no investment income. They had originally budgeted for a 5% investment income. They did not receive any of the investment income. And so just a slight decrease in how they're covering that. But remember, if we go to the next slide, you'll see there's an adjustment, right? So now we've got $2 million to cover, and we're only covering 464 with those contributions and that endowment draw. So how else can we get there? And that's where we would say, start playing with the model and saying, do you reduce your expenses? Are you going to have a COVID-related fundraiser? What are some other ways, Dean?
Yeah, Kathy, I think when you talk about validating your story and documenting and memorializing what everybody was saying, as Venable said yesterday in their webinar, these are the scenarios that you're going to want to walk through, right? You're going to want to say that, yes, our school we started off with a gap that was only $500,000 that we thought we could bridge, and now we're walking into a scenario that has a gap of $2.1 million, just based off enrollment and financial aid alone, right? And that is the very easy to understand documentation and memorization of the gap and the impact right there, right? Is that normally we operate on a $500,000 gap, and that's what our auction is for, and all the fun things that we do for some community building. And now we have a much larger gap, and now we're going to have to look at, again, we know the private school model is pretty easy, right? It's tuition, it's investments, it's fundraising, and it's expenses, right? And those are the primary levers we have that we're going to have to do. So here's one way that we're going to have to do it. I think that we'll get into the actual model here in a second, but I feel like these are the basics of telling the story and a good place to start. What do you think, Jennifer?
Yes, I'd muted myself. So sorry.
Yeah, no, all good.
Yeah, I think this is exactly where you need to start. I was just typing in the Q&A that we already don't charge what it costs. So there are a lot of different things we need to consider here with the gap. They're just going to be made a lot worse. So I think you're on the right track.
Great, great. Let's go to the next one,
So
Kathy.
the next question is then cash flow. Okay, so now we understand what does that do to our operations? What does that do to our cash flow? Particularly if we took out PPP funding, what does this look like for us? So this is just a slide that gives you some basic scenarios. And you'll notice in this mild impact, they still have considerable cash walking into their walking into July 1 of next year. Some of that is unrestricted liquid assets. We know what that is. Most of us know that is going to be pretty much your deferred tuition that you collected up front, right? And then they also have a line of credit they could draw on. So if we go to the next slide, what we'll see is for this particular school, they've collected 60% up front. There you go. So they collected 60% up front, so they've got $16,000 to kick off the gate. And what you'll see is there's this bar in the middle that shows $0. That's where you start to have to dip under your cash reserves, and you say, okay, now I have to draw my line of credit. That red line shows your line of credit. So you started off with 16 million, and as you progress, you're seeing throughout the months, and what the model allows you to do is put in where your expense is happening. Remember, they're still paying down debt. Is that a lever they can pull? What can they do to help with this liquidity? Because if not, one, they've got an issue. They're going to be below $4 million in the hole whenever they, at the lowest point in April, before they start collecting tuition for the next year. And the other thing is, if they've only got 4.6 collected before they head into the next year, but they had already collected 16 million of next year's tuition, that means we already know we're significantly behind the curve as we're walking into next year. We're digging our pit a little bit deeper.
Yeah, that's that whole situation of robbing Peter to pay Paul, right? We're using those, we're seeing that we're going to need to use those deferred dollars, which is really for next year, to kind of keep us afloat right now. And that's a trend that for most schools becomes very hard to stay above water, right? That's just not a long-term sustainable trend.
And if I could jump in here for a second, I think that to the extent that you can also tie this to how it affects your staffing. So if you didn't have the loan, would you have to make adjustments to payroll in order to get you to a place where you could withstand some of the things that you see coming in the next few months? Keep in mind that the PPP loan was, originally created to allow employers to keep employees employed, right? To keep people off the unemployment rolls. And so to the extent that as you are looking at these models and telling your stories, you can continuously tie it back to payroll and staffing and, keeping teachers employed, I think that's going to be valuable.
Well, Grace, and I think that that's a great point, because Kathy knows and Jennifer knows as we're having these conversations now, if these schools said that, yeah, we had some resources, but if there was no PPP funds available, we would have started just knowing where we were and kind of looking forward a little bit, we would have had to make cuts immediately. Right. Like we would have had to be, fiduciary responsible enough to say, okay, well, if this is our current situation and we're closed, we're going to have to, sever employment contracts immediately.
Since this has come up, I'll point out that there was a comment in the Q&A and I responded to it. The messaging around this is really, really tricky, but families are asking for refunds because if schools are accepting PPP funds, and it goes back to some of the misconceptions, not only around the business model, but around the purpose of the PPP as well, which is, as Grace said, almost purely payroll related so that you can keep, retain staffing levels. So I know families are really hurting too. I don't begrudge them for asking for refunds. So you do have to be really careful and sort of navigate your school's culture and messaging this back. But that's why I also mentioned earlier that we already don't charge what it costs to educate our students. So however you can kindly, transparently and empathetically educate the community a little more around your business model, it may help the messaging of some of this. You also do not have immediate access to restricted endowed funds. And there's a big, big difference between what the board may restrict, which we all know is not truly restricted. Actually, I shouldn't say we all know. A lot of people don't realize that's not truly restricted. Those funds can be redesignated at any time by the board, but monies that are restricted by a donor cannot be. So these are just some considerations to think about internally, but also when you're messaging to the community.
Yeah, and on this particular slide, I think, you know, Grace yesterday was talking about really memorializing what was going on. I
Right.
think one of the things I would think about is put your worst case scenario in there before you start saying how you're going to take care of that. Take pictures of this, take screenshots of this, copy this down, then start plugging in. Okay, now what if I laid off staff? What if I this? What if I this? How do you have to get that money back up to an even platform?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And we'll kind of walk through a couple different models here, Kathy, before we jump into our the actual toolkit itself. Yeah, go ahead and take that sip of water, Kathy, because here we go. We have definitely more models. And unfortunately, based on some of the insight that NBOA had and some of the models or the survey questions that we had earlier, there could be impacts that are more severe. I mean, this is a large school that had the big endowment, right? If you look at it on paper, this school has a big operating budget and a big endowment, significant per se, right? We'll just kind of keep it in quotes. Let's talk about this one. What if they do have a 25% decrease in enrollment and a 20% increase in financial aid? What are they looking at, Kathy?
Absolutely. So if you remember on that last slide, you know, they were budgeted to have $500,000 operating gap. Then it went up with that 1% decrease and that double hit. Whenever you come back with they're asking for more financial aid, they were at 2 million. Well, now we're at $5 million that we're down, right?
So go ahead and go back to that slide. There you go. Stay here for a second, Marie. Go ahead.
Yeah. So, and you can even see what does that do on a per student basis. Like you're looking at on a per student, your operating gap was about $400. It was very manageable. There was a way for you to be able to offset that. Now you're looking at $12,000 per student, and this is a large school. You've lost several students, so your per student ratio is going to change considerably. What does that look like? And then if we move forward to the flip side, how are we going to cover that? We've also, go to the next one. There you go. So now we've said the annual fund, because you have to remember, if we said that our the number of our students are going to decrease by 25%, even if everybody gives the exact same amount of money, you've got 25% less people giving money. So you're still going to have a 25% hit to your annual fund. And if you lose some of your investment income, even if it stays flat, there's no loss, just you haven't brought in the investment income you expected to, you're only being able to cover that gap at $214,000. There's a huge difference there. And that next slide kind of sets it side by side. And now you're looking on a severe impact. The school is going to have to make some hard decisions. So Marie, go ahead and go to the next slide. There you go. And I'm going to pause there and I mean, this is just so impactful and really shows, you know, we thought that we were in a good place. We were really one for one, almost our budget versus what we thought our operating gap was versus how we were going to be able to cover that gap of contributions. And now we've got this really big divide. And so then it starts looking at, we need to play with this model and figure out what do we do differently. We need to make evasive actions quickly, right? In this severe count.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Okay, so if we want to keep going, then we're going to look at the liquidity. Now in this, you'll notice liquidity, the cash is a little bit less. Why is the cash less? Because we weren't able to collect as much. Right now is the time that you're collecting that money. April, you are collecting your money. Well, let's say that this school normally collects 60%, but you just can't collect it right now. Everybody's asking you, can you wait? Can we do a payment plan? And that's one of your concessions. So you're allowing for a payment plan. So if you go to the next slide, now we've only got 6 million in unrestricted assets. It was a great point Jennifer brought up. Those are not your donor restricted endowments. Those are going to be your unrestricted liquidity that's available. And so if we start looking at that, we start saying, look how much earlier in the year we started to dip below a problem. Like we really have to take some different measures to evaluate how do we get that brought up. We may need to call our loan company and ask them, can we not pay some of this principal on our debt? We may need to lay off some teachers. There may be some other things. We may need to have a COVID fundraiser. All of those kind of things. What do we need to do to offset that? Remember, at this point at the end of the year, we should have $8 million in the bank because we should have money for next year, and we're just not going to have that.
Yeah, that's great. And I know we've done other webinars at Armanino as well about nonprofits going to their permanently restricted endowed donors about potentially releasing some of those funds. And that's a whole nother conversation. You can go to our website and pull that one up and the legalities around that. But, you know, that is a situation that, you know, schools might have to find themselves in.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go ahead and, oh yeah, now let's go to, that's the big school that, hey, right, a lot of kids. There could be, we know there's a lot of, you know, the smaller schools out there that are independent and that have very much created their niche market per se. Let's talk about impact to them.
Absolutely. And in this one, the other thing you'll notice it's different. One, their financial aid as a percentage is a little bit lower than was in the bigger school. And in addition, their entire endowment is board designated. They do not have a donor restricted endowment. They've got fully a board designated endowment, which brings up a different set of questions, right? So if we go to the next slide, you can see here, same kind of scenario. We had budgeted in this school, we had already budgeted for about a $1.5 million operating gap. We knew there was already going to be a gap with this particular school. When we drop enrollment by 1% and we increase our financial aid by 5%, we're going to go to about a $2 million. Remember, this is our mild impact scenario. So if we go to the next slide. Now, on this slide, remember, no real decreased annual fund. We've lost 1% of students, but we have had some investment income. Here we're bringing in a little bit less. We thought we were going to bring in about $900 or $900,000 from other sources to cover that gap, and we're only bringing in $700. So the next slide shows the impact of the school in total. So in total, we thought we were going to have a 1.5 gap. We were covering it with 900,000, just 950. And we were going to have a little bit of a difference there. Now we've got a bigger difference here, right?
Yeah, that's great. It makes it very clear to see. And I think that, you know, again, we know that with regards to head of schools and administrators, sometimes they don't understand all of the numbers, right? They just look to the business officer and say, hey, Jennifer, you got that, right? And now this makes it easy for you to tell them, hey, here's where we were and here's where we are. We need to make some action. We need to take some.
Absolutely. They need to understand the different levers you can pull and the ones you can't.
Yes.
Great. And let's go to our more severe impact and then let's jump into the toolkit.
So the only thing I would show you a little bit different here is, remember, you've got $4 million of board designated funds. So if you quickly go to the next slide where we look at that liquidity, here's the difference. In this liquidity scenario here, that straight line at zero amount, that is where you come to zero before you have to start dipping into your board designated reserve. And I think that's an important story to say, look, I had to dip into my board designated reserve. And why did you have to? And what is the purpose of your board designated reserve? I think Grace did a really good job on that yesterday on the webinar. They talked about, you know, defining why do you have your reserve and what is the operating reason for it to exist, and does it affect your financial aid long term? All of those kind of questions you can evaluate with this slide.
Yep.
And then if we go to the next slide, we can look at what is a more severe case. Again, big drops. Similar story here. If we start dropping 25% in financial aid, we have to reevaluate these levers. We're not at 2 million, we're now at 4 million. If we go to the next one, again, bigger hit, right? Bigger hit to the annual fund because we don't have the students to make the contributions. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see that there's that total impact. Remember, before, that total impact was a lot smaller, right? It was a $2 million gap. Now we're having to say, what is this $2.5 million and where is that money going to come from? What levers do we have to pull to get this, to minimize this back to a place where we can be sustainable?
Great. Now, Kathy, let's, you know, when it comes to action items, we know if we can't control the revenue, or we can only control the revenue so much, that means we're going to have to look at other items. Can we now open up the toolkit and look about how we can kind of predict on the expense side a little bit?
Yeah, so we can go to that same model on the toolkit. So I believe if y'all want to stop sharing, then I can share the toolkit real quick.
Great, Marie, go ahead, Kathy, here we
There
go.
we go. Okay, so I'm going to turn my face to that screen. So this is the toolkit. So in this particular case, this is that worst case scenario for that middle-sized school, right? So here's the middle-sized school. We have said that we're going to have a 25% hit to our to the number of students that we were bringing in. we've got that big gap here that we need to deal with. This is exactly what we were looking at, right? So we've taken the 25% hit to our annual fund. So one of the questions may be, how much can we harness out of our donors? You know, we've got 300 students going to the school. What is our capacity? You know, how much can we leverage out of them? Do we think that we can get another 500,000 there? Is that one of the, and we can see that's going to help and bring this number up a little bit as far as how are we able to cover that gap? We had a 4.3
Right, Kathy.
million.
So that means, right, if someone sees that, if there's a business officer who sees that, could they start talking to their head of school now, to their development director now, saying, hey, we have this gap. This is what it's looking like. Do you think our community can absorb some kind of COVID-19 fundraiser, or do we have some major donors that we can go to? That's kind of the mindset that we need to have to be talking about this and your abilities.
Absolutely. So you're budgeted here on your ability to cover your gap, increase instead of decreasing. That's good news. That's the way we want to go. And you're operating, then you have to come back to your operating side. This is good news, but it's not enough. So how else am I going to cover that? Dean's exactly right. Then we start looking at, okay, we're not going to get any summer programs. Are there any other auxiliary programs? Maybe we can offer some online courses. Maybe we're going to offer some guitar lessons or something more here.
Grace, are we seeing that in schools, you know, and Jennifer, for summer, is there kind of any other summer programs that schools are trying to prop up?
I've seen a couple of schools look at doing virtual summer camp. That lends itself, you know, to, you know, schools that have camps that are geared towards sort of academic courses can do this a little bit better than sort of like the tennis camp. You know, but robotics, typing, you know, gap year, you know, sort of math, you know, beefing up your math over the summer, all of those things can happen sort of virtually. I think that they've learned a lot in how they've done distance learning this spring already. And so they're trying to quickly pivot and offer some of that over the summer, and looking at sort of their enrollment contracts for the summer to ensure that they have some language about, you know, the fact that this is going to be virtual and what are the privacy concerns and things like that. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree. We're seeing the same. And something interesting that arose from the crisis early on was because independent schools did such a good job pivoting, really, all things considered, very quickly to this distance learning model. They actually started hearing from students who had been accepted for next year, their families asking if they could go ahead and start or enroll this spring because the virtual learning that independent school was doing was so successful. I heard that from several. So they're carrying that kind of success over into the summer as well, in many of the ways Grace just mentioned, but really targeting your newly enrolling families and getting them on board early, perhaps to fill some gaps over the summer that they may not have otherwise had in the spring because of the pandemic. So that's interesting.
Great, great. Kathy, what if a school doesn't have the significant donors and they can't get the $500,000 of COVID-specific fundraising? Say they can only raise $100,000 and they need to trim, maybe they need to trim expenses. Can we show what that looks like to the model?
Yeah, so here, let's say that you're like, yes, but a lot of my summer programs had expenses related to it, and I want to decrease a lot of those expenses. Let's say that I can pull some of my student activity expenses down 25%. Or even if I start to say, you know, I really don't want to lay off teachers, but maybe I'm going to do some attrition. Think teachers that leave through attrition, we're not going to hire a replacement. So I think I can potentially, you know, we can move on with less than, with taking 10 teachers out of that total equation. Then we come back up here, we're back down to our best case scenario again, right? And we can keep trimming, or we can keep adding as we think is necessary.
Let's take down the COVID fundraising number.
Okay.
Let's consider that maybe schools don't have that ability. Let's, you know,
yeah,
make it
so this
100
COVID
grand.
fundraiser is only 200,000, let's say. Not 20, 200. There you go. So now we're back here. This is how we're covering, but we still have a $3 million gap. So we're going to have to evaluate how do we get to that gap? And it may be that you determine we cannot, with fundraising, deal with this type of loss. This is our worst case scenario. We've lost 25% of our students. maybe since we've lost 25% of our students, we're going to have to come down here and we're going to have to take 25% from other costs as well. There are some other things we're going to have to start to reduce. And in this table, you can change the names of these to really make this personalized to your school in the areas that you think that you could reduce expenses the most. Some of our schools, what we've heard is we told our teachers they were all going to get a 4% rate increase. They're not. We're going to have to come back to them and say, I'm so sorry, but in order to not have to lay off people, we're going to have to come take that 4% increase and just have a flat rate. In that case, again, we're really coming back down and closer. Now our model, we're looking at about $1 million we need to make.
Grace, we're getting some questions with regards to, you know, this is really definitely looking towards next year and the impact of next year. What about with the 10 weeks or the remainder of the 2020 fiscal year? What kind of insight are you giving your clients there? I mean, obviously we have the budget to actuals there. Is there any insight that you're giving your clients on that?
Sure. I think you're referring to Frank's question, which is a good
Yes.
question about, you know, when we look at the PPP loan, are we really looking at just can we survive the next 8-10 weeks, or can we really look to the rest of this year and into the next school year? And I know that there's some, you know, different people, different lawyers saying different things out there on this. And, you know, look, our interpretation and our guidance has been that the law talks about ongoing economic uncertainty. And that does not limit us to the next 8 weeks. And like we said earlier, you know, if we didn't have this loan, are there things that we would have had to do differently within the next 8 weeks in order to prepare ourselves for what's coming down the road? And so we do think of it as a big picture analysis. Certainly you want to focus on, you know, keeping people employed in the next 8 weeks, because that's one of the primary purposes of the loan. But I do think that when you are creating your data and telling your story, you do want to look at what's going to happen over the summer, what's going to happen next fall, and you can pull these different levers to create your financial picture and your outlook, at least in the, you know, for the next few months to a year, to sort of justify your good faith certification.
That makes a lot of sense. We had another question that came in with regards to different financial aid resources and modeling. Jennifer, any insight you can provide on that?
Yeah, so I think that, you know, I pointed to what we learned from 08-09, and I think there's more to learn from that. There is some work that we've done with EMAs. This is Roberta's question. Okay, Roberta, I would encourage you to email me so I don't forget, but I'm happy to share this with all too. I'll send it to Dean so they can follow up. There's some modeling that we started looking at a really high level, just to conceptualize what could happen with schools. I think the best advice is not to talk to these families who may be new to seeking aid because of the pandemic in the same way that you might your traditional financial aid families. Certainly you want to meet all need and all of these conversations with transparency and compassion and empathy, but you'll be better off in the long run if you can funnel families impacted, hopefully in the short term, from the pandemic through maybe a different process, at least different language, maybe even a different fund, some emergency financial aid funding, for example. There may be a fundraising opportunity around that in particular. If you get them in this sort of traditional financial aid pool, it's really hard to get them out. So you need to be clear about that up front, what you're committing to, what you're offering in a non-chilling way. I mean, in a very empathetic way. You know, a lot of people we don't have a crystal ball. We don't know what it's going to look like. But that's the best advice I've seen so far. I realize that's not a concrete model for what to expect, but I think what you can expect is that your current financial aid families' need is going to go up, and you're going to see a lot of families who, you know, traditionally were maybe full pay, who now need help. I think you're right that they're bringing in partial tuition revenue in most cases. This is where the interesting modeling around filling open seats in order to get some tuition which is better than none, is a valid conversation to have right now for schools. I would advise against straying too far from your mission. You don't want to bring in students who are not mission aligned, or who won't be successful at the school in the long run, just to get some of those tuition dollars now. But to the extent that you can find the resources to support families with need, retaining your current families is way, way easier. And I take that with a grain of salt. I realize it's not easy, but it's a lot easier than bringing in new families at a time like this. So those are just some of the considerations, but I'm happy to send some of these resources to Dean and Kathy to send out to you afterwards.
Hey, Jennifer, I had also heard some of my schools talking about how they were going to extend payment plan options and then do it on a case by case per month, as opposed to giving you the full, if the family had lost their job, instead of giving you the full aid up front, instead they're saying, okay, let's do this on a monthly basis, and each month you'll recertify to us. That way, once they do pick up their job, they could go ahead and continue their payment plan.
Yeah, that's a really interesting approach. Or maybe take it semester by semester. Their time is money too. And I know people handling your financial aid requests may not have the capacity to do that kind of thing every month. But I think that's wise. Think about how much has changed just in the last week, the last 6 weeks. We have no idea what the next year is going to look like. So having the conversation and assuring families that you're going to do everything you can to meet them where they are, once we know what this looks like, is helpful. A lot of families are asking now because of fear of what could come in the future and hasn't really hit them yet. So I think you need to figure out what would be there. I think, as to Roberta's question about what would be advisable, certainly the more families you can bring in who just need a little bit of aid as opposed to full tuition, going to help your bottom line. There have been a lot of scenarios that we've analyzed over the past few years that have shown that we're at one extreme or the other with financial aid. You have a lot of full need families, and then a lot of families who may just have really small awards. But it's those ones in the middle that I think might get lost in this process that you have to think about. So just use a net tuition revenue model, and that'll help you figure out at each grade level, don't get too far out of whack in one grade level than another. You want to carry through a reasonable amount each year so that you're not on this roller coaster ride budgeting if one class is really, really financial aid heavy and another one isn't. It's certainly an easier pill to swallow to think about helping students closer to graduation than students at really early years. And yet at the same time, if you help the family with a student early on in the school now, then, will they stick with you and come back to support the school in other ways later on? So a lot of different considerations.
Very helpful, very helpful. We are running out of time, but there was one question that we wanted to circle back on. Everyone else, if we didn't get to your question, we'll be following back up with you after the webinar. But Grace, earlier you talked about some concern with regards to PPP funds and mortgage encumbrance and interest and things, some of that. Can you give some insight there just on things to be aware of?
Sure. So if you take the PPP loan, that is considered federal financial assistance, which requires you to comply with non-discrimination laws that you might not already comply with. For example, Title IX, it sort of has more robust requirements in terms of how you respond to a complaint of sexual harassment or sexual abuse, both for students and employees. And so with respect to mortgage interest, rent, and utilities, there's a lot of gray area here, and quite frankly, we might get more guidance before the loan forgivability application comes out. But in the meantime, what we do know is that there is some language in the SBA regulations that talks about mortgage interest attaching to real property and having that extend your compliance period for these non-discrimination laws. Normally, the compliance period ends when you get your loan forgiven or you repay the loan. And that's why a lot of schools are sort of taking on this temporary compliance obligation, knowing that once the loan is forgiven or repaid, they can, sort of revert back to their former policies. So out of an abundance of caution, we are looking at utilities and rent the same way that we do mortgage interest, and concerned that, would that attach to real property and somehow extend the length of your compliance with these other laws. And so for that reason, if you can, try to limit your use of the loan to payroll costs and benefits during the 8-week period, to the extent that you are going to ask for forgiveness at the end of that 8-week period.
Great. Thank you so much for everyone for joining us. We're just about out of time, and I know there's a lot of questions. We'll circle with everyone. Again, please reach out to us, anyone here, Grace, Jennifer, Kathy, or myself. Thank you so much for joining, and we're here to help you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.